Okay, welcome along, ladies and gentlemen, to your weekly SETI seminar series. Today we're very fortunate to be joined by Bob Richards, who's come across to us from Moon Express's base at NASA Ames. Bob has had a fascinating career thus far. He started his education at Cornell, where he was a special assistant to Carl Sagan, and was educated by Frank Drake, who will be familiar to everyone here. Bob was instrumental with his friend Peter Diamandis to setting up the SEDS, the the Students for Exploration and Development of Space, which is a student group that does exactly what that says, exploration and development of space, and that was started in the 80s and still going strong. He has also been instrumental in setting up a couple of different universities. So you may have heard of the International Space University and also the Singularity University, which is a new university summer series over at NASA Ames. Bob has also been involved in Mars missions. His company built the LiDAR that traveled on Mars Phoenix and detected falling snow, and he says that he can draw on his Canadian heritage to tell us that there's snow on Mars. It takes a Canadian to recognize it, apparently. But today, Bob is going to talk to us about his most abiding interest at the current time, which is returning artifacts to the moon and robots to the moon. He's going to talk to us about how his company, Moon Express, is going to win the Google Lunar X Prize. So if you'll join me in welcoming Bob.
Thanks, Adrian. Yeah, I think it's... Everybody hear me okay? Yep. Magically on. So I'm so thrilled to be up here at this podium. Usually I'm in the audience watching the speakers. And the SETI Institute and the people involved in its founding, not the least of which, of course, is Jill here, sitting in the front row. I'm very honored to have. But as Adrian mentioned, Carl was a leader, a pillar in my life, and really I blame mostly for my fascination with Mars. And finding my way to Cornell was no coincidence. That's where Carl was, so I needed to be taught by Carl. And Frank was there too, and between the two of them, people like Arthur Clarke really were the inspiration for the little that I've been able to contribute to our growth as a species and attempts to get off the planet and become a multi-planet species. And everything that I've been working on, and been very blessed with being able to work with amazing people and meet fantastic people throughout my life, has really been vested into this idea of creating a multi-planet civilization. Part of that exploration gene that I think is part of all of us, but more manifest in some of us than others, that makes us do crazy, risky things. And I think every species might have that small percentage that really does want to sail out, over the horizon or reach beyond that mountain, or whatever it happens to be that seems to be a crazy idea to 98% of the rest of the population. And in our generation, those of us who advocate the exploration of space, I think, are in that crazy 2%, upon which the survival of the entire species may depend. We really do know that we eventually need to become a multi-planet species. It's a question not of if, but of when. And in our generation, I think we are living in this epochal period, so fortunate when this transition is just taking place, where we are becoming part of a spacefaring culture and have taken the first tentative steps. I'm going to talk to you a little bit tonight about this inspiration that I've found, not just within myself, but within many others that I've connected with around the world that are really want to try to make this happen in our generation. Adrian mentioned my friend and colleague and partner in conspiracy, Peter Diamandis. Those of you who know him may understand that, I've learned many things from Peter, but one of the greatest virtues I learned was the virtue of impatience. One of Peter's laws is if it's worthwhile doing, it's got to be done right now. Whereas people like Jill, of course, have infinite patience for the grand vision that she has for an equally important possibility in our future. So I'll talk to you a little bit about this sense of inspiration and the perspective that I think we need as we decide how, who, when we need to pioneer this new frontier. And then more specifically, what I'm doing about it right now, along with some other people. And some of the predilection that I have to the side of entrepreneurship and enterprise that I believe is absolutely vital to catalyze the next phase of our exploration and development. So, pioneering the new space frontier. So, a bit of a twist on words there, but the new space word is becoming a little bit more popular in our culture. It does represent a little bit of the vanguard, a little bit of the outlaw side of the space community. New space being defined by those new companies doing things new ways, breaking the mold a little bit. And we'll talk about some of those in this presentation. But maybe a thought really to put things in perspective, not what we have to do on Monday, but what we have to do in the next 50 years, say. Or the 40 years. Where do you think that we should be as a species in 2050, if you imagine outward? And it's really, I learned from Arthur Clarke that predicting the future is a very risky thing to do, especially if you're trying to predict the near-term future. The long-term future, that's easier, right? But it's the short-term future that we tend to radically underestimate of what's possible. So back in the day when we were founding the International Space University as students, trying to connect people all around the planet and figure out how could we possibly do this, knowing back then that there was not something called the internet. Okay? And so in our plan for creating the International Space University, we knew that we need to somehow electronically connect all the students and the professors. So we needed this electronic network of some kind that we could communicate with video and messaging, and we called it ISUNet. And then Al Gore, of course, went ahead and invented the internet. So we took advantage of that. But we could not have predicted, the escalation of technology that would enable the world that we have today. And you think back, to the movie Back to the Future, when it was talking about going from 1985 back to the 50s and all the, the hilarity of how things had changed. Well, just think back to 1985, and how funny would some of the things be, right, that we would see back then compared to what we have now. So when we think about the world of 2050, remember, we live in an exponential reality. We tend to think in a linear term, which is part of what we teach at the Singularity University that Adrian mentioned. So as we think about this exponential future, is it going to be one of constraint, where we are worried about and completely immersed in our planetary problems and challenges, where all of our resources are tapped into just mere survival and we're trapped as a species in this two-dimensional world on the surface of a ball? Or do we actually have, if we expanded our presence in space and have started to build our infrastructure, do we start to see the visions that Arthur saw for 2001 and 2050? Where you have not numbers or tens of people, but hundreds or maybe thousands of people starting to live and do economies in space? Or do we think that we actually, if you listen to Chris McKay and others, we'll actually have our presence on Mars, we'll be a multi-planet species, and we'll be moving out there among the inner planets of the solar system? Is it possible that we've expanded farther? Is that what our vision is in 2050, where the outer planets are now part of our exploration sphere? Or do you want to think, you know, maybe things are much more grand than that in 50 possible years, forward 40 years from now, where we've actually discovered that we're not alone in the universe and we've connected with a galactic reality or an intergalactic reality of life in the universe. You know, what might these futures be? Well, we sure know that where we're starting from, and this sphere of water and earth that was, you know, riveted into our minds during the 1960s when the first pictures were sent back from space of the Earth as one sphere. And then as we started sending our planetary probes farther from the Earth, we started to get the sense of perspective that really started to impact our psyche as a species. And the farther that we started to go out from Earth, the lonelier we started to feel looking back as our space probes gave us these visions of the Earth. And as the Earth falls away against the stars, eventually become this, as Carl poetically described, pale blue dot against space. And this image, help me, is, I'm not sure if this is Voyager or this is Cassini image, thank you. So, in Carl's poignant words, we're given this sense of perspective, and it's something that the species seems to know intrinsically. You know, we came from the stars, we came from space. Maybe there's something inside us that actually calls us back. But as we continue to move out, we see even further evidence of the, not irrelevance, but specialness of our planet and our species, lost among the vastness, and finally lost among the vastness of galaxies within galaxies. So we have the sense of, you know, it's a big place. And as we get back to Earth, we start feeling a little bit more secure. This is our home. As Carl said, this is where we make our stand, but this is also our springboard. Now, the cosmic perspective that Carl perpetuated is not just in dimension, but it's also in time. And the cosmic calendar of years that are behind us is something that has been very influential for me, and maybe many of you have seen this as well. But to look at this calendar, which is really the history of the known history of the universe, compressed into 1 year that shows how everything that we know on Earth, all of the history of our civilization, is so compressed in the last few minutes and few seconds of that cosmic year that, you know, 1 second before midnight of that cosmic year was the voyage of Christopher Columbus. And we are starting to venture out into our own voyages beyond the planet now. You know, when we look up beyond the shore of Earth, of course, the first thing we see is the moon. It's actually quite unique to have a planetary system like this we found. The moon is part of this planetary archipelago, right, that we're fortunate to have. And I think it's been such a dominant force in our development as a species and as a culture and our evolution. It just makes so much sense that it should be there to inspire us to reach out. And even better news, it's not only a stepping stone to the future, but it's also like a Rosetta Stone of science. There's so much history of the Earth-Moon system and of the solar system trapped in the moon, waiting for us to discover. Its airless body gives us the opportunity to look back in time because it hasn't been changed like the surface of the Earth. So being one of those humble astronomers, I really do appreciate the science that we can get, that we can learn from going out to the moon. But I also believe that the ultimate destination for humanity as a species, as much as the moon is a very convenient next stage, it's an island, it's got resources, we can definitely utilize it as a springboard. Mars continues to be, I think, the destination for the species to really expand ourselves to another planetary surface, and of course the most Earth-like, where we can again find science and try to answer Chris McKay's question of the second genesis of life or not, and maybe the world most hospitable to us as we currently are manifest as our species, not to dismiss the opportunity or the possibility that we as a species, as soon as we move out into space, will evolve very rapidly. We see this. We see that the isolation and exposure to elements that we're not used to rapidly evolves species. And we may become very quickly the Homo spacians rather than the Homo sapiens that began the journey. You know, there's lots of reasons to move into space. You know, this is one of them. You know, we're pretty sure that we're not going to be wiped out next Tuesday. But it might happen. You know, planetary impacts of this magnitude, obviously not common, but they do happen. These asteroids are great biological cleansers of the planet. You can ask any dinosaur. And we're, as you know, what was it last week? The asteroid flew by us within the 7,000 or 8,000 miles, certainly within the orbits of the satellites, and so these things are really hard to see. So we need eventually to be secure from a single point of failure on a single planet as we are today. You know, there are these mass demonstrations in Canada against global warming. Now, whether that's whether human beings are actually the ones that are impacting global warming or not, certainly it's a situation where we have to take seriously as a species. Otherwise, we'd have these mass demonstrations like this that we just can't handle. Okay, so now the question is, okay, we need to go into space. We've gone into space. We've done it one way for kind of 40 or 50 years now. Is there a right way to go into space? You know, what we've seen, I think, is an exploration dichotomy of a sorts. In the 1960s, you had a very charismatic president laying down a challenge to a country disposed to political issues and challenges from offshore, and convinced a country to spend a significant portion of its wealth on reaching a destination that president really had no right, to say, because, my gosh, within 10 years to send a man to the moon and back again, they didn't have the technology. He didn't know what the materials were. There was no institution that you could even start with to build such an enterprise. But that government line of thinking, led again to the attempt to go back to the moon with a new program, and of course, spinning up the government approach. The solutions that were attained in the designs were very much like the ones that had been derived decades ago. So you have the government side of the equation on how exploration is done, which has resulted in magnificent discoveries and achievements. And then you have to ask at what cost and expense is worthwhile in our society today. And now more recently, you have this phenomena of the private sector, private money, people with the capital of small countries deciding to do fantastic things in space. And in 2004, the Ansari X Prize was won for the first private spaceship to reach space, funded by a private individual, Paul Allen, of course built by Burt Rutan. And you have now a multitude of companies, a multitude meaning less than 10, but more than one, attempting the private sector exploration of space. SpaceX, of course, is one of the most prominent, with Elon Musk initially putting his private fortune behind it, and now many other investors jumping on board. And SpaceX is showing, I think, very convincingly that the private sector can do amazing things for a fraction of the price that governments will do them. Here's a friend of mine. Buzz was smart, right? He handed Neil the camera. It's true. I mean, that's why most of the pictures are Buzz. So but this picture is a phenomenal picture, of course, that really created a new generation of thinking. That was what year? 69. I just talked to a bunch of students before this talk, that was their grandparents' program. It wasn't even their parents' program. It's so ancient history. What is it today? Sorry, grandparents. No, with all due respect to grandparents, this happened a long time ago. And so what is it today that the young people can really embrace and get excited about? I think this is an iconic photograph, and this is a very recent one. I think it was January, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe it was February, President Obama made a speech at the Kennedy Space Center and talked about the new type of policy that the White House wanted to embrace of NASA partnership with the private sector to do these great things. At that time, the SpaceX launch pad was being readied for Falcon 9, and President Obama went out to the pad to take a look at this private sector initiative. This is President Obama walking on the right with Elon Musk, right, the new captain of the new space industry. Following behind the president and the industry guy is the administrator of NASA. So I think that's a kind of an iconic photograph that really caught my attention. And then you have some new kids on the block, the astropreneurs that are now inspired to try to reach the moon with private capital, with reclaiming and redoing replicating what the governments did back in the 60s with robots, but doing it not with thousands of individuals and tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, but with a small group of people doing very innovative things for much less than that. Some of the motivation here, at least one of the things that I'm very interested in trying to accomplish, is the expansion of Earth's economic sphere. And if you think about the way that the economic sphere has evolved, even over the last 100 years or so, it's following an interesting pattern. The economic sphere was really, pasted onto the surface of the Earth for most of the history of our industrial society. And it wasn't until aviation began in the early 1900s and ultimately personified to the public by Charles Lindbergh, who was the first person to fly from New York to Paris, 1927, Spirit of St. Louis. That inspired a commercial aviation immersive experience for everybody, because people decided that this isn't something just for the elite or for the government, but this is something that everyone can do. So commercial aviation really started to define the economic sphere. People started flying around the Earth. And it was the early ComStats that started to arrive in the 1950s, 50s, 60s, that started what is today the most affluent industry in space, which is communication satellites. Depending on how you measure it, $1.6 billion or so of revenue flows through the geosynchronous orbit, 40,000 kilometers from the surface of the Earth, every year. And now, around 2010, you have this cluster of very wealthy, mostly .com entrepreneurs, investing their own money, and they're all clustered around this kind of 400-kilometer realm of personal spaceflight, taking people up for adventure or tourism, with Bob Bigelow wanting to put a permanent private space station up. So this is where the private economic sphere of Earth is being moved up for people. What I'm interested in, what the Google Lunar X Prize is about, and what Moon Express is going to do, is establish a new height for the economic sphere of Earth. Another order of magnitude, up to the moon. So by planting the economic flag at that level, we're hoping to draw the rest of this capital outward. So in this way, we're expanding the economic sphere of Earth, eventually to the moon, and then, of course, asteroids, and it keeps going from there. But where the economic sphere evolves, human beings will go, as will lawyers. But we can't help that. So this opportunity that some of us are feeling is really, the time is now. Why is that? Because, we have a lot of people talking about gloom and doom. We have the shuttle being retired. We have the U.S., really the thought leader of what people should do, what human beings should do in space, really kind of lost at sea. not really having a defined vision, a lot of infighting. What is it that gives entrepreneurs any sense of hope that this is a good time to do anything? Well, there's a difference today that didn't exist even 5 or 10 years ago. And it's a combination of technology, of science, of economics, and politics. And, you know, this is a multivariable problem. And none of these, any of these are out of alignment, it could take down your plan. I believe that it's all in alignment right now. I believe it's a absolute beginning of the opportunity for the privatization of space. It was, you know, in 2004, we saw it with Spaceship One, but now we're talking about a brand new market at a new level of economic sphere. Moon markets, you can argue what the ultimate market will be that will drive the economic sphere out to the Earth orbit. It might be mining, it might be space-based solar power, manufacturing, tourism, and entertainment. I think the answer is not just one of these, but all of these. Moon Express is more excited than about one in particular than the others, but I think people will embrace all of these eventually. It's the mining of the moon, and there's many questions that we can talk about of what that evokes. Mining the moon, what does it mean, like legally and so forth? We could talk about that. But the emerging reality that the moon holds is a reservoir of resources for the Earth in a place that's not that far away. At the bottom of a very, very small gravity well that makes it very easy to not just work there, but to bring things back. The precious metals, the rare earths, the things that we're discovering in the broadband information that's coming back from lunar orbiter probes like Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter is telling us things about the moon that are just astonishing. You know, we thought for decades after we abandoned the moon after only 3 years of exploration, we thought, hey, it's just a dry rock. But now, you know, we're looking a little closer and we're discovering that there's an enormous amount of new things we didn't know were there. Volatiles are very important, of course. The water discovered on the moon, that there might be vast concentrations of water at the poles and maybe even a mechanism by which water is being generated around the equator and being transported and all these wonderful ideas. See, the thing about water is it is a game changer for the moon because it is rocket fuel, right? It is air. It's a stuff of life. So it's really valuable once you're there, but the problem is that the water's not valuable until you're there. So the water's not valuable until it's valuable. So there's this catch-22. As soon as you have a cislunar industry and you have Earth-Moon economy, then the fact that there's water in the moon is a game changer. It liberates everything else. But what would be really, really good is if there was a potential for a short-term economic dipole between the Earth and the moon, something of short-term value. What could be possibly of the moon have that could be of value to us here on Earth and increase our standard of living? Well, there's a number of ideas. You know, Harrison Schmitt, Jack Schmitt, Apollo astronaut 17, the only geologist to actually visit the moon, will tell you, in no uncertain terms, it's helium-3. Stupid, type of thing. And he's got a lot of valid arguments why that might be the case. But there are precious metals like platinum group metals. There are industrial metals. There's a lot of sources of lunar materials that can be used not just on the moon, but off the moon. I mentioned technology. Moon Express is going to be using technology that really wasn't available until fairly recently. It's the microminiaturization of technology that's allowing smaller landers and propulsion systems to be developed. There are commercial launches that are now available that weren't available before. And you can negotiate better deals than you could before. So this gives us the opportunity to buy our own rides into space that just wasn't available before. Here's just 3 of the companies that you can buy rides from, and these are U.S. companies. And there's another number of other commercial launches available if you want to go offshore. You can get good deals. Microminiaturization of electronics, CubeSats, microsats, things that you might hear of that students are doing, are really becoming capable, just like our smartphones in our pockets have become extremely capable. So are small satellites. Good things come in small packages these days. Small packages means that they're very economical to send to space. You know, mass means money when you're trying to send stuff to stuff to space. Propulsion systems that are really swords to plowshares that were built for weapon systems that can now be used for civilian systems that could get us to the moon. NASA Ames, our neighbor here, where Moon Express is resident, came up with a brilliant design for a common spacecraft bus, which provides kind of a modular economic way of being able to stage a spacecraft for a multitude of missions and purposes. And we saw this as a fantastic opportunity to be able to use it as a baseline for testing for the design of our own lunar lander systems. The science on the moon, we've talked about a little bit. This Rosetta Stone, this planetary data system, is allowing us to take a look at valuable data for mining and analysis. We're looking at the asteroidal impacts on the moon. We've talked a lot about, we in the space industry have talked for many years about the value of asteroids. And the first trillionaires are going to be made in space. I believe that. Do you have to go to the asteroids to do that, is one of the questions. And people will argue with you about the advantage of delta V, the amount of energy that it takes to get to the asteroids is actually less than it takes to, say, to go to the moon, to actually get to the surface of the moon. So why wouldn't you go to the asteroids where you know the concentrations of high-value platinum group metals are, for instance? Depending on the measurements, you believe, you know, there's trillions of dollars worth of value in your average metal iron asteroid. There's a compelling argument that we're starting to believe more and more, that if you look at the statistics of bombardment on the moon of the asteroids over the eons, a very small percentage of this, which translates into a lot of mass, actually impacted the moon, these nickel-iron asteroids, at a velocity and at an angle that did not vaporize them. Most of them were vaporized, and that's why the lunar regolith has these trace elements of these valuable materials, which are very hard to concentrate and very expensive to concentrate and so forth. But there's compelling evidence that maybe not all of them vaporized. Maybe some of them broke. Some of the asteroids shattered. And maybe these concentrations and these blocks of valuable concentrations of materials are waiting there for us to actually go find. Interestingly, we don't, in all of the data that we have and all the reconnaissance and all the pictures and all the data sets that we have so far, there's nothing in those data sets that disproves or is a kind of a smoking gun that proves the hypothesis. It's a very intriguing idea. But isn't it interesting that for all we know of the moon, we don't know that this might not be the case, if that double negative makes sense. That there could be tremendous wealth very either on or very near to the surface of the moon, waiting for us to liberate. So this gets into the economics of when does it become economical to mine the moon? What type of infrastructure would have to be in place to do that? You can look at these big numbers and you can argue $1 billion here and $1 billion there, but something like $10, $15 billion is likely the amount of money you're talking about to put the infrastructure in place to be able to process and mine lunar materials. That sounds like a lot of money. It is a lot of money. But let's say if you compare it to your average mine or your mining operation and the money it takes to actually open up a viable mine, it's on the order of a modest mine. So it's not an enormous number when you're in the mining industry. It's a big number, but it's not enormous. And if the answer is that $15 billion could possibly bring back $40 billion a year in materials, then there's some economics that you can start playing with there. Now, politics always wins. This is one of the things we do teach at the International Space University. You can have the greatest idea in the world, the economics could be there, but if the politics go against you, you're not going to win. So why is the political situation today opportune? Well, believing in entrepreneurship and that not just the United States, but particularly this area of the United States is the place you need to go to find the risk capital that's available to do these enormously, not just potentially rewarding, but economically challenging business cases that you probably couldn't argue anywhere else on the planet. the U.S. right now has a need to find new ways of doing business in space. And it's the public-private partnerships that I believe that we're engaged in developing with NASA that I think is really the way of the future, where you find the right partnership between government and industry, where the risk of the mission is more aligned with the economic risks that investors are willing to take, and the long-term big things that governments and NASA are so fantastic at doing are left to the researchers and engineers at NASA to develop. While you leave in the trail of this exploration the transportation systems, the businesses that the private sector should really be embracing and doing. And you start getting into a infrastructure build, whereas agencies like NASA and other space agencies move the frontier forward, industry in the private sector is embracing and creating the infrastructure for continuing human presence. So with some of these ideas in mind, Moon Express was formed only last year, about a year ago. And it was formed out of investment coming from the Silicon Valley. And it was formed not only to compete for the Google Lunar X Prize, but to respond to a challenge that NASA had put out for the private sector to deliver data that would be valuable to NASA in its consideration of its future lunar missions. The founders of Moon Express are myself and a fairly well-known Silicon Valley individual named Barney Pell, who worked with NASA Ames for almost 10 years. A number in the audience here are very familiar with Barney. And a very unique individual who I was searching for, because I had met this individual, Naveen Jain, through Peter actually, a little over a year ago, and discovered that Naveen had this passion for space and just a wonderful person, loved entrepreneurism and commercial aspects of space, had not ever delved into it himself. He was one of the only billionaires in the block that didn't have a commercial space company. And we started talking, and Naveen said, you know, I love this stuff, Bob. I love the commercial space things that you're talking about, but I don't know much about it. It's not my industry. Naveen made his wealth in .com companies, and he really knew that part of it. He doesn't know the space part of it. He said, but if you can find somebody who can bridge us, who knows about Silicon Valley type of financing in the world that I live in, Naveen live in, and also understands the world you live in, Bob, the space world and the NASA world, then maybe we can have something to do. So I went out looking for that bridging person, and I had been working with Barney at the Singularity University for about a year. He'd been on the board, and I knew everything about Barney and his successes in Silicon Valley and how he'd created a number of startups and exited to Microsoft, which became part of the architecture for Bing, and he sold his company for something north of $100 million. I knew all that. What I didn't know is that he'd been a NASA engineer for 10 years. So when I took him out to coffee and asked him if he knew anybody that might fit this mold that Naveen had been describing, his face lit up and he said, I'm the guy. So the Moon Express was born out of this unexpected friendship that we already had through the Singularity University. We have a great team that we're building. Some of them are here in the back. Jason Vergala there, one of our first project engineers. Wave, Jason, yay. And Rick Hertz there, who's our NASA liaison. It's an incredible team we've been building. I've been picking people mostly out of the space mafia of the International Space University. And we've got about 13, 14 full-time people right now, about 20 people in total working in the project. So small, really, really enthusiastic, doing amazing things. And these are wizards. I mean, you'll see them, you know, designing CAD programs and then running out to the tech shop to actually build the materials late at night. And then, you know, as you see Mike here in the picture, wrenching it on. So it's we have what I would say is a nice mix of the gray hairs to the youth, right? So we have this nice ratio of really, really great experienced people who have done this before, and the 20-something generation who are the ones in that generation before, so many before them, that built the Apollo program. The average age of Apollo, the average age of the people who built Apollo was 26, right, 20s. And there was no, the magic of that, there's no middle management, right? There's no middle management that could tell them that you can't do it that way. It's not like that anymore at NASA. Many of my friends will tell you. But it's those people that have the passion and the imagination. You just have to light the fire and stand back. And then have a little bit of guidance along the way and to do amazing things. So I'm really proud of the team that we're building just a couple of miles down the road here. Now, the model that we've chosen with Moon Express is a little unique in the industry. It's about, we've been partnering with NASA to help us understand the technology we need. We talked a little bit earlier with some students about, why would you want to reinvent the wheel? Why put all that effort into inventing technology that already exists? Because NASA, for instance, has done amazing things. So not only were we lucky enough to be chosen by NASA, lucky takes a lot of hard work, by the way, but NASA selected us as one of the recipients of their Innovative Lunar Demonstration Data Contracts, which is a $30 million program NASA put in place to supplement that which Google was offering for the X Prize. And this allowed us to launch very quickly as a company about a year ago. This contract is not a grant, nor is it a guaranteed amount of money. It is based on the same model that NASA has used in the COTS program that's inspiring SpaceX and Orbital to create technology to deliver crew and cargo to the space station. It's a success-based deal. So you say you're going to do something, you do it, and then you get paid. So, and if you don't do it, you don't get paid. So it's a different type of relationship that NASA has with industry in this type of contract, where industry has all the risk, because there's no guarantee you're going to, of course, succeed. So the taxpayer is not at risk unless something's actually done, and then the taxpayer gets the value. So I like that, because I don't mind taking the risk as an entrepreneur. Neither do the investors. And the government doesn't mind, because it's not, milking out the money no matter what happens. It's only paying out for success. So it's betting on the winner from the very beginning. When we put our proposal into NASA, we were happy to find, after the selection was made, that not only were we selected, but we're actually rated #1 by NASA across all the evaluation categories of the proposal. There were 11 proposers. 6 were selected for this contract. 3 ultimately were given the first task order under this contract, which began last September. So at the same time, we announced that we were also going to be a contender for the Google Lunar X Prize. This is a $30 million purse for the first private company to send a robotic spacecraft to the surface of the moon, deliver high-definition video and images from the landing site and from 500 meters away. What is that in American? That's 300 yards, 400 yards. Yeah, it's about the same, right? Okay. Yes, okay. I digress back to the 2004 Ansari X Prize just for a moment. Some of you might have heard the story, but does anybody know what the actual challenge was that the spaceship, the height or the altitude at which the spaceship needed to reach to win the prize? 100 kilometers. You got twice within 2 weeks, absolutely. Do you know that when the X Prize was announced, that altitude was not 100 kilometers? Guess what it was? 100 miles. And then through the education over the next few years of the people trying for the prize, feeding that information back, X Prize began to realize that was an altitude too far. It was actually over the limit that actually decreased the chances that someone's going to win it. So they very quietly switched it from 100 miles to 100 kilometers, knowing that nobody would notice. And nobody noticed. So that's the. But with the Google Lunar X Prize, the first prize is the $20 million first prize purse. There's a $5 million second prize, and there's $5 million in bonus prizes for doing various things. Now, the great thing about this prize is the prize exists, right? It's $20 million. It's a pretty good customer, right? I'm pretty confident they're going to pay if you do it. The bad news, it's COD, right? So they don't pay up front. They only pay, so it's kind of like, you know, climb Mount Everest and do a backflip, and then we'll pay it. So getting to the moon is really hard. It's about finding the economic reasons why anybody would want to front you the money to do this. I don't know about any of the other teams, but I can tell you the people backing Moon Express are not interested in the private sector equivalent of Apollo, you know, kind of the flags and footprints. They're interested in really opening up a frontier for humanity, really doing something special. Taking some risk, yes, but it's about what comes afterwards. The prize is a wonderful consequence of reaching the moon for Moon Express, but it's not a primary driver. The prize, the Google Lunar X Prize, is on the table until 2015, so there's still a few years to go. People are going to start getting really nervous about a year from now. Anybody who hasn't bought a rocket a year from now. It takes about 2 years typically for a rocket deal to go through. So, you know, between now and this time next year, you're going to see a very interesting time in the Google Lunar X Prize where those who have actually put down the money for a rocket and are proceeding with a flight program will obviously be the ones that will be contending. If you don't have a flight program a year from now, it's very unlikely you can pull off a flight program in less than the 2 years remaining before the money's off the table. So it's going to be a very interesting period for the X Prize in the next couple of years. So we're working really hard on building a lander system. We're working really hard on building a team. We're working really hard on our NASA contract. But we're also working very hard on a payload that we've been contracted to develop by another local, Steve Durst, runs a company in Palo Alto called Space Age Publishing. He publishes a space calendar and a various amount of space publications. He also has offices in Hawaii. And Steve and I've known Steve for ever, decades, let's say. And Steve has a passion for the moon. He has a passion for astronomy. And the reason that he has offices in Hawaii, it's on the Big Island, is because out his window he can see Mauna Kea and he can see the observatories on the top of Mauna Kea. And so he's had this dream of putting a telescope on the surface of the moon, even if it's symbolic. In the future, doing astronomy from the moon and having the moon as a place for and a destination for humanity is what Steve's all about. So we're building a telescope for him that will be a prototype of a larger one that will eventually go to the south pole of the moon, is where he wants to send it. The prototype instrument that we're building for him right now will be demonstrating a terrestrial version of it in just a couple of weeks. We're working really hard on that right now. And within a couple of years, we're hoping that that flight instrument will actually fly to the moon with Moon Express and take the very first images of what Steve calls the first light, the galactic center. He wants to take a photographic image of the galactic center from the surface of the moon. We might even get some alignments going like 2001, but we'll see. But it's a very, hopefully we'll get some good science out of it too. But it's something that he's very passionate about. So Moon Express, we have a multitude of projects going on. And I guess the message is that, you know, as you build a business plan, it's the only thing that's certain about your business is the plan that you think you have will not be the plan that you ultimately execute. So while we have our focus on building a transportation and data services company for commercial lunar activity, we're also building other capacities within the company in order to do other things that bring value to anybody that wants to go to the moon. Part of that is design and simulation, and a big part of landing on the moon is learning how to land without hitting something that you don't want to hit. And because we won't have humans aboard, like Neil, who can steer away from an unexpected boulder field. We have to have a lander, a robot really, that has the visual acuity, the intellectual response time to know that there's a hazard and be able to avoid that hazard. And this is a big challenge for any planetary landing mission. No mission to date has ever had an active hazard avoidance system on board that has the capacity to divert the lander from a hazard, whether it's a rock or a crater or a slope or an alien. It hasn't happened yet. But in order to have reliable and frequent landings on the moon or any planetary body, you have to have this, with robotics, you have to have this technology. So we're working hard on that. So what we hope is that within a couple of years, you'll be seeing Moon Express, the very first private moon landing. I thought I'd talk about something new tonight that has never been talked about before, so giving you guys just a little bit of insight that we haven't talked about before. My partner's back there saying, "You're showing the wrong slide." No, I thought we would actually show this slide, which has never been shown in public before. Only NASA has seen this. So this is one of the reasons we were selected by NASA for our concept of our mission. This represents our main lander system. It's not very big. Two of us could put our arms around it. It's kind of a big coffee table. But flying off of it are these little poppers, these little tiny, tiny landers that are in themselves missions. You know the Russian dolls, right? Right? So imagine landing a mission carrying a bunch of missions. So think of the economics of that. So going back to my mentioning of miniaturization of electronics and propulsion, being able to build tiny microlanders that can actually pop up our main lander and go do stuff. So in the same sense of CubeSats delivering space technology opportunities to students and universities, we're hoping that this new technology will be able to deliver research opportunities on the moon to students and universities and companies and anybody else that wants to have missions. So we'll be setting out a bit of a press release about this pretty soon, but I'm pretty excited about this. These really are, I think, have the opportunity to bring lunar research to students, and I see some of them in the audience here. And wouldn't you like to own one of these things that are flying and get to say what it's going to do, right? And these things can fly far. It doesn't have to hop off like a piece of popcorn. You can send this really far. So I'm pretty excited about that. Moon Express is planning a number of other exciting things we'll be talking about in the future, but all in all, it's not about just to boldly go. It's really about to boldly stay. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your patience and listening to me, and thank you very much.
Well, it seems like somebody wants
I think I offended somebody.
Yeah, wants to
My
get the press release out before.
See you.
Bob, you mentioned that we'll get to know how the field looks for the Google Lunar X Prize in the coming years very shortly as people book their rides and stuff. Has anybody, to your knowledge, how does the field look from that perspective? Has anybody booked a ride yet? And
so one of the teams has Astrobotic, which is a very formidable team, led by Red Whittaker, a famous, very well-known roboticist, led by a friend of mine, David Gump. They announced a deal with SpaceX a number of months ago for their rocket ride. So the challenge is that the timing of your purchase is very important. A rocket costs a lot of money. It represents at least half the cost of the mission. A Falcon 9, you can look on the website, it's on the order of a $50 million buy. So if you're buying a $50 million thing, there's the payment plans might be favorable, but it's still a lot of money. So the timing of the purchase of the rocket for Moon Express is critical, and it's not the fact that we haven't bought one today is not because you couldn't, it's because it wouldn't be the right time for it. Yes.
Excellent presentation, Bob, as
Thank
always. So how far can these hoppers hop off or fly off? I assume some of them have autonomous mobility once they're off, but how far can you project them?
So it depends is always the answer, right? So, and these are not finalized designs either, but certainly anything from hundreds of meters, as would be the minimum, to perhaps kilometers or tens of kilometers. I think your limiting factor is not so much how far you can go, as how far you can communicate, right? Because you're very quickly over the horizon of the moon, and these things can go over the horizon very quickly, particularly if you have, if you're in an area of large relief, right? You go over a hill and you're done. So you have to have a whole system in place, right, in order to be able to communicate. So maybe you want to have one on the hill and one over, you know, maybe they could start operating in swarms and intelligently together. You can imagine what robotics could do if you have a number of things. That's why I'm pretty excited about it, actually. Yeah. Yes.
Again, on the hopper, so a confirmation. They're flung off and then it stays, or can it keep hopping itself by itself?
Well,
is it, or is it just flung?
Like the lander. The lander actually has a hopping capability itself too. Rick will help me if I get in hot water here.
Okay.
But the micro hoppers have the ability, well, theoretically, to do more than one hop.
Okay. So they hop off. They're not flung off like shot off by the main unit.
Well,
or catapulted off.
Our baseline is to catapult them at the beginning because they do have toxic fuels, which could impact experiments and the lander itself. So likely it will be a catapult to get them enough away before they actually right. They won't like launch from the lander.
And then the second question is, your main unit goes. How many micro hoppers are you talking about? 2, 3, half a dozen?
The micro, depending if they're kind of a 3U, you know, microsat, a CubeSat type formation, or a 6U. They're on the order of 5 kilograms, depending on how much fuel you have. So we could have one, or we could have potentially up to 10. But you start talking about real estate and everything else. But it's on that order, a handful.
Oh, great.
Yeah. I would love to see more than one and a few type of thing. Yeah.
You spoke of the X Prize as having a deadline of 2015, the Google Lunar X Prize. And since FAA is now in the launch business, giving the launch licenses and the experimental launch licenses, where does FAA authorization and things like planetary protection requirements and international outer space treaty policies fit into all of this?
Margaret, I thought you might go there. I don't know. It figures very prominently in all of this, and it's something you have to give them enough lead time for. Like in everything you try to do that potentially impacts others, there's a regulatory regime here of launch licensing that you have to get through. There's a regulatory regime of communications, which is probably harder than the actual launch licensing. No commercial entity has ever operated outside of geosynchronous orbit. So there are questions that nobody's even really asking or knows how to answer, let alone how to ask. Planetary protection, as you participated in some of these discussions, Margaret, the moon is not subject to. However, some of it is, right? And yeah, and the way that we behave on the moon is going to be prominently up to the people who are doing the behaving. Moon Express, I can only speak for, and we will be advocating responsibility, although while being bold enough to assert that which governments have done themselves in the past, as far as rights of scientific inquiry in the moon, and rights not to be interfered with, and rights to bring stuff back that we call ours without having to claim title or exclusion to the area that we've occupied, things like that. But it's going to be interesting conversations. Yes?
So I saw that the modular common bus features quite prominently in your lunar lander. I have the opportunity of working on the LADEE spacecraft this summer, which is the first to use that modular common bus. And I was wondering, to what degree is that design owned by NASA, and to what degree is it available to private companies?
Rick, do you want to take that one? We have a representative of NASA Ames here who actually represents our relationship with Ames from the Ames side on our Reimbursable Space Act agreements that we've...
Yeah, okay. The Common Bus is essentially available through a Space Act agreement. The designs and the things and of all the subsystems and the designs of the spacecraft itself, we've made available through Space Act. So previous to Moon Express, there was a signed Space Act with one of the earlier Google Lunar X Prize competitors. And all of the Google Lunar X Prize competitors, just as an example, have been offered the same package, design package, an architecture package that Moon Express has. So that is available through Space Act, through a Reimbursable Space Act with Ames, and it's available to everybody equally. So I guess that answers it.
Doesn't mean it's easy to get.
Doesn't mean it's easy to get, and it's not cheap, but it is available. The same package is available at the same time as the common spacecraft bus evolves through programs and applications like LADEE. The feedback, I guess, of the upgrades and of the enhancements that are made get plugged back into the architecture. And likewise are available through a Space Act. So.
Very important question. Thank you. Thanks, Rick.
It's just about the moon lander. I was wondering what kind of technology do you plan to use for positioning on the surface?
So the choice of the landing site or the navigation to that site?
Yeah, the technology for positioning, I mean, throughout the mission. Yeah.
So it will be, standard, star trackers, inertial measurement units, and maybe, as I was alluding to at the end there, some cartographic visualization.
And, for the micro hopper also?
I don't know. That's depends on processors and things.
Okay.
Likely not so much.
Okay, thanks.
That's going to be a hop and hope, I think. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the talk. In my perception of historical ages of exploration, what distinguishes them is, among other things, is recklessness and profligacy and lots of failures and people dying like flies. And if you contrast that with, the current mode of exploration, of space exploration, and both manned and unmanned, where we're demanding, extremely high reliability, extremely low failure rate, it just seems almost impossible. So, it seems like that's what has succeeded in the past. And I just wonder whether we're even capable of that sort of recklessness. If you're not killing people at a certain minimal rate, you're not having fun.
I think that's as incisive as you could get. I wouldn't argue with you. The paradigm that has slowed us down is the aversion to risk that government-based agencies have to have. So, the days of early Apollo, where you had the heroics and the people knowing the risks, risking their lives, and people accepting the risks and accepting the fact that people died, doesn't exist today in the space program. Where a catastrophe where 6 people lose their lives can shut down the entire program for years on end. Because it seems to be a national tragedy of some kind, rather than a celebration of this is what it takes to explore, and that's what they dedicated their lives to. So in the private sector, you can have informed human beings taking those risks test pilots do. They make a choice of careers. So I think it's this balance of, it's not a good idea if you're trying to create a transportation company to carry passengers to kill a lot of them while you're developing your system, right? Yeah, so it's going to be very interesting in the early ages of personal spaceflight. There will be a catastrophe of some kind at some point. We're just all hoping it doesn't happen the first time Virgin Galactic tries to fly. You know, it could, right? But hopefully it doesn't, or the others. I mean Virgin Galactic among others, right? But for people to take up a challenge, calculate the risks, make personal choices, and move civilization forward has to be part of our continuing evolution. It's that, and those of us, as I said, with this manifest exploration gene, need to be allowed to manifest that. Otherwise, we're dormant.
Oh yeah. So I took from your presentation that you're going up in a rocket, but I don't know. There's sort of, I mean, yeah, you're just using conventional fuel, sort of like we have been doing so far in most of our space missions. But there's kind of a lot of talk on like what are the new propulsion systems that we're going to be using in the future, because those are the early ones are kind of like they waste a lot of space on payload. But long story short, yeah, what are you doing?
So eventually, Moon Express will likely, like most companies, have a percentage of its budget that goes into R&D and starts pushing the edge. In the early days as a startup, the trick is balancing the risk and the reward for the investment appetite of the people that are backing you. So a very important part of the business proposition here is the insurability of what you're doing, because the upside is great, but the downside is what people worry about. So the insurability in the conventional markets, conventional meaning those that make a living out of insuring and underwriting satellite launches, for instance, convincing them that you have a system that is not so dissimilar from what they're used to, that they'll give you a rate of insurance that's reasonable, and you can fit into a business plan that if, in the likely case that something goes wrong eventually, you can recover your capital and keep going. So the more you have untried, unproven, risky, new stuff they've never seen before, the more likely they either just won't insure you and you're just on your own, so all your capital is at risk, or the rate is going to be so high as to make it inaccessible. So it's that balance of not trying, of pushing the envelope, but not pushing it so much that you navigate yourselves away from insurability. Does that make sense?
Hey, hi, Bob.
Yeah. Yeah. We could talk later. Okay, right? Okay.
A couple of
hi, Doug.
Hey, Bob. How you doing? A couple
hi, is you.
clarifications. Did you say that the lander could hop too? Is that?
I might have.
You might have. Okay. And can you use the hopping to go the 500 meters?
Yes.
Yes.
You might be able to.
Okay. And how big did you say that? Just last question. How big?
But I mean, just to be serious, Doug. I mean,
yeah.
When you have the capacity to hop, it becomes the same risk-reward scenario. So it isn't automatically obvious that hopping is less risky than roving, right, or using another technical device to get there. There's some romantic, ideas that hopping is really easy, but so one side of the equation says, hey, you've just done this, just do it again, and the other side of the equation says, you just accomplished the riskiest maneuver in the entire mission. Thank God you're down to the surface. Why would you ever leave the surface again? So, sorry.
Okay, and you said, just one more clarification. You said that these things are about 5 kilos a piece, or more or less. Okay.
Could be heavy. Depends on the fuel. Yeah, but small. Yeah. I know this is going to be on Parabolic Arc tomorrow. It's already there now. Thanks, Doug.
You had mentioned moon impact debris essentially as one of your feasible business models as far as collecting precious metals from the surface. But you also mentioned that as a hypothesis, it had a hypothesis. It had neither been proven nor disproven. So how, for the purpose of garnering support from investors and other individuals, do you plan to go forth and pursue proof for that?
We're already investing in private science analysis, just like, let's say, a mining company would do. there's research that gets done in the private sector, and we're doing that. One more?
Space is starting to look like my desk at work with stuff all over the place. Is there any plan to clean up after, the mission is done and not leave debris on the moon?
Well, we're not leaving the moon. And at the beginning, whatever we're putting there is staying there. It'll be, so I would say that our first landing, the first private sector landing, if I could be just generous, is going to be declared a historic site. Just like Apollo 11 is, right? So just like Spaceship One is hanging in the Smithsonian, right? So will this historic site be somewhat hallowed ground on the moon. Now, do we want to be throwing garbage on the moon from here? No. We didn't want to do that to orbit, but we will. But we have to be more responsible. So I can't speak for everybody, but I don't want to clutter up the moon irresponsibly. But there's a cost associated with not doing that.
Adrian's letting me ask one more question.
All right.
Thank you. So you started the talk appropriately with a big picture with Carl Sagan's Pale Blue Dot and all that, and then also appropriately went into the nitty-gritty of what you're working on now. So I'd like to open it up again and ask you, once you've won the X Prize, what are you going to do next?
Convince Peter to offer an X Prize for Mars.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How's that?
I don't think you can beat that, but could he have an X Prize for SETI as well?
I think that would be one. Let's work on that.
Yeah.
Let's work on that. Awesome. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks very much, Bob.